You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Hi, everybody. It's me, the Fedge, host of Inside the Eye Live. Before the Sunday mainstream media political pundit talk shows, there is Inside the Eye Live, where we break down some of the weekly mainstream media talking points before the talking points even get aired. Add in some entertaining stories, weather, cats, intriguing and informative guests, and you get one of the most listened to Saturday morning streaming media political talk shows going today. And it's all right here on our flagship station, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. So join me, the Fetch, for Inside the Eye Live every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern. It is truly intelligent media for the politically aware.
Welcome to Sacred Matrix, a divine paradigm of love and universal consciousness, with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Together, we transform the world.
And now, here are your hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I am your host, Janet Kira Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin. And today we have an incredible interview with Dan Winter. And Dan is coming to us from Europe, around the Paris region, Paris time zone, and it's 2 a.m. for him. So we really appreciate Dan coming on board here. But before I pull on Dan, let me tell you a little bit about his background. I have a long bio at aquarianradio.com. You can read and learn everything about Dan. I've got a big page up for him, but I'll just give a summary of it, and I'll let him tell you more. Dan Winter's background is as multifaceted as his viewpoint. Graduated with honors from the University of Detroit, Dan pursued graduate studies in psychophysiology and the origin of languages. In addition to his academic background, he has worked as a systems analyst with IBM, an industrial metallurgist and crystallographer. He has undertaken many diverse studies, from quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab to developing the early biofeedback prototype equipment as Dr. Albert Huxley's protege. While he traveled, Dan has sojourned to study at the School of Sacred Gymnastics in Florence with Buckminster Fuller, the Giza Pyramids, Israel, the Andes, and at Findhorn. Dan is an accomplished keyboard artist and was once a church organist and choir director, all before reaching high school. He delights in playing computer keyboard music using sonic samples taken from biological events, heart sounds, whale and dolphin songs, etc. His creative side emerges as playfulness with ideas which can be shared at different levels. And he, in the 80s, founded an alternative newspaper called the Network of Light. He established a learning center, experimented and collected bioharmony called Crystal Hill Farm. And his bio just goes on and on and on. He's such an amazing person. We're going to talk about many of his projects which are going to transform this planet. Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say before we bring on Dan?
Oh, just I'm excited about this show. I've been looking at things that explain everything, sort of theories of the universe, and I think that Dr. Winter's stuff can explain just about everything. And what I like about the way it relates to human beings, it shows how we can be capacitators and coherent with the universe.
And with that, welcome, Dan, to our show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
We're so happy to have you here. Well, this is your show, and I guess before we start, since this is a new audience for you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I just wanted to briefly a bit about who you are and your work.
Well, thanks. That description is perhaps 30 years old or something. I think I'm turning the corner here on trying to discover immortality. But more recently, we have been looking at the physics and electrical engineering of bioactive fields that do time reversal, what's called conjugation, plasma technology, and implosion technology. We have implosion technology for agriculture, theimploder.com. We have capacitive fields that accelerate life, purify.com. And tonight I've prepared some material about that as it relates to your specialty, which is the sort of the ancient history of the bloodlines and the Anunnaki story as it relates to that technology of bioactive fields.
Cool.
Yes, we love the Anunnaki information. I don't know if you know much about us, but Dr. West and I have written 3 books on the Anunnaki.
Right.
And it's kind of taken it in the avenue of Zechariah Sitchin, but, Sitchin's been dead for 5 years, so we build upon that with other researchers. But you have a piece of the puzzle with Anton Parks, which I'm not familiar with, and then you have your own research. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about what you've discovered.
And people sometimes get caught up in the history story to the point of controversy in politics, and that's okay. As with my friends, Vincent Bridges, we used to joke that once you've learned the science lesson, then the history story is transcended, as it were. And if you learn the sins of history, then you're not condemned to repeat them. So I like to turn the history story into a science lesson. So I have never tried to focus on proving the events of history so much as to learn the principle behind them. And that's where I think the science of what is a bioactive or transformative electric field, literally electric fields that reduce aging, etc., that is one of the primary science lessons of history. And particularly, I think it is the science lesson of hermetics, Hermes, and the caduceus being a symbol for what I call phase conjugation, a kind of implosion for waves. And where I've prepared the story to connect with this kind of Anunnaki history, and I think we talked about this a little once before, is starting from that point in the sort of ancient Sumerian, where the language talks about. It is said, "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord," which was translated to be, "I will raise an altar unto the Lord" in the Bible, where the word Shem, as in our word chemistry and alchemy and schematic, and that term, which became Shem-an, was so central that we believe that Sitchin spent many years trying to figure out how to translate the word Shem, which later was translated to mean the altar in the church. And Sitchin, not having a background in electrical engineering like I do, translated that word to mean high word fire stone. Now, I think actually that's a very creative language on his part, because in my view, a Shem is an implosive capacitor, example being the Ark of the Covenant, which is a bioactive field generator. We believe it's centripetal capacitance. It's called, the technical term would be phase conjugate dielectric, meaning just an implosive capacitor. It was layers of acacia wood and gold, which form a certain kind of, it's called high dielectric, which what that does is that causes the electric charge lines to cross in a way that looks like pine cones kissing noses. And that's called a conjugate dielectric, where the dielectric refers to the quality of the insulator between the plates of the capacitor. In the case of the Ark of the Covenant, it was plates of gold with high quality acacia wood between them, which we believe would be a wood which contains high dielectric materials. And that means that a high dielectric capacitor, which like is your house if it's sacred space, is such that if you rang that capacitor like a bell with voltage, it would ring with more energy than the hammer with which you hit it. And this is why the Ark of the Covenant could non-destructively contain radioactive materials, because it's a centripetal capacitor. It's a charge field that's imploding. And this was why also it made the kind of spark which enabled gold powder manufacture. And Lawrence Gardner devotes a whole book to the physics of gold powder manufacture with the Ark. The book is entitled The Sacred Ark. So we're getting back to what is a bioactive field. But before I go on, any questions so far?
This is fascinating.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Josh. What's your first question?
Well, we can go on with this, but this is so much like what Bob Farrell was talking about, how there's this momentary thing in an electron and a positron going off, and there's something called a positronium. And once this starts deflagrating the area around it, it causes this wave. And this is different language, but it feels to me like the same stuff. Am I on the right track at all?
Yes. Much of the mystery of science and history about how fields create what's called negentropy or self-organization or time reversal or age reversal, all of that mystery boils down to aligning wave fronts in such a way that they meet each other perfectly, coming from the opposite direction. And we have a very detailed physics of what that is and how it works in phase conjugate optics, where if you cause lasers to meet in exactly opposing directions, 180 degrees out of phase, in what's called a phase conjugate mirror, you have proven detailed physics for time reversal, negentropy, and self-organization. And the magic is that when the wavefronts converge exactly opposite, they can converge in such a way that they thread together in a perfect opposing vortex pair, and we say visualize pine cones kissing noses. And actually, this is an introduction to the electrical engineering physics of what brain waves do to make bliss and peak perception, literally the flame in the mind. And this is another area of my expertise with psychophysiology and biofeedback, where I invented a brainwave device called the Bliss Tuner, which built upon Professor Korotkov's work in Russia, who showed that when children learn to see without their eyes, one way you can tell they're having peak perception is when their brainwaves make golden mean ratio between the alpha and the beta component of the power spectra, which extended turns out to be exactly the alpha, beta, delta waves of the brainwave power spectra are actually based on the precise known harmonics of the Schumann resonance harmonic series as a cascade, all of which turns out to be a cascade which is precisely tuned around 7.8 hertz, etc., to Planck time exact integer exponent of golden mean ratio, which we now know is called phase conjugation. All of that means is the
when
brain...
the energy bounces off, is it always at a right angle, or does it slow down each time it hits and bounces?
No, that's the right question. Literally what has to happen is the wave fronts must converge in exactly opposing directions, which is called four-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics. You visualize lasers making a square and then a cube. And the way they converge so perfectly so that the optical lines or the flux lines do this perfect vortex, it's like pine cones meeting on the head of a pin and in a phase conjugate mirror. And in your brain waves, the right and left hemisphere make this golden ratio cascade, which is how you identify peak perception. Oh. And we, in fact, in my book, fractalfield.com, has a detailed chapter expounding the view that phase conjugation is the cause of perception. And we know much more. We also know that the right and left hemisphere must be 180 degrees out of phase. And this is the physics of what's called flame in the mind or psychokinesis. we know, for example, that when Ingo Swann heated a thermistor, a temperature sensor, at a distance with his mind, the same way the Cherokee and the Bon Po are not a shaman until they've lit a flame with their mind, the so-called bonfire, that the physics was that Ingo Swann did this through a Faraday cage, meaning transverse electromagnetic could not pass, meaning it must have been longitudinal. And we even know, which is called compressional, and we even know, incorrectly called scalar, we even know how the brain waves make the longitudinal component, the compressional wave, because with the right and left hemisphere 180 degrees out of phase, that conjugation creates, translates a transverse to a compressional wave. And incidentally, this might take us, well, it's called the flame in the mind, but this might take us back to our story, because the translation of vorticity, which translates the rotational component, the so-called transverse, to the linear or compressional wave, which is very difficult, very rarely understood in electromagnetics, although all acoustic waves are longitudinal. In electromagnetics, it's very, very poorly understood, except maybe the Nazis bouncing radar, but most people don't know what a longitudinal electromagnetic is. But anyway, the word for that was as the spiral on the cone that translates the transverse to the longitudinal. The word for that is making the translation of vorticity called the L, or the phase shift, as in Elohim. So we may be able to get back to our story here.
So it's the spirit of the thing.
Well, where I want to go with this story, hopefully, is to discuss the attempt at immortality in the blood chemistry of our ancestors, the Anunnaki, Draco, Uru, Nephilim, versus the human blood chemistry, which was more of a cross, ours based on iron, theirs based on a lipid oil-based blood. And so their ability to achieve a charge compression, implosion, coherent plasma, aura, etc., had a completely different blood chemistry than did ours. So their attempt to get immortal, which is specifically to get your aura phase coherent enough to penetrate through the speed of light, the so-called L, that attempt by their race had a completely different blood chemistry than our possibility, something that Enki's kind of cooked up here when he did that bloodline cross. His mother snuck in the white Draco. That's kind of another story. But what we want to focus on here is, look, we know that the Anunnaki Sumerian, the largest catastrophe they describe on arrival here is the catastrophic increase in the rate at which they were aging.
Right.
And you know that from your study of Sumerian better than I am sure. And and so they had to build this, so to speak, Shem unto the Lord in order to reverse this catastrophic aging process, which is to say they had to build a bioactive field, which is what Sitchin called the Highward Firestone, which is literally the altar in the church. So from an electrical engineering perspective, a church does not have an altar until it has a capacitor that makes a bioactive field. And that's what I do for a living. So I'm an electrical engineer.
Well, that's what we do. Let me just slow this down a little bit because I'm getting lost. Okay, so we found that the pyramids have a purpose. They focus the energy, and they have an energetic reason. So they're saying that the church is the purpose of the altars in the churches. We think it's decorational and for worship, but there's actually another use for it, which is to harness the energy.
In fact, yes, what I'm saying is the only meaningful definition of sacred space is the ability to make a bioactive electric field. It's similar to my friend Dr. Korotkov tracking the Kogi into the wilderness to where they would make phone calls to their ancestors, which has tremendous survival value. And he measured the capacitance of the air and proved conclusively that you can only make phone calls to ancestors in places where the air is literally fractal, which is to say where the charge distribution efficiency is implosive, and that creates a sort of druid phone call capability. And
okay. Am I getting you right in is this jumping ahead that people connecting tantrically create a biological capacitator of this very same kind that the Anunnaki had to do with the Ark of the Covenant and things like that?
Yes, I'm saying that human peak perception, human bliss, and human kundalini, which I teach the biophysics of, create an implosive phase conjugation in a living plasma around the body, literally a cold plasma field. And the plasma field does not have to be hot if the center is conjugate or implosive and therefore centripetal. So by definition, the human aura is a cold plasma field in the same way the rotating cold plasma fielding around Keshe's monoatomic gases. So immortality consists specifically in the ability to make that field effect coherent enough to be projectable. Literally, the only real definition of the word Shem on, the Shem we now know means access to the black hole. That's what a bioactive field is. Implosive capacitance is a Shem, and so Shem means access to a black hole. We know that physics. Nassim has helped. And An means sun god, Anu. So a Shem An is a very specific projectable plasma field, which the Egyptians called your Ka, as in your boat into the underworld, which we now know is the coherence of the aura. And the Ba, as in Kaaba, is that part of the capacitance, the plasma, which is projectable through the speed of light, which is to say longitudinal. And so we're beginning to get the idea that the human condition during peak metabolism, peak perception, and bliss and kundalini can create a very coherent aura, which is then projectable. And you can take your organs of perception with you, which is why lucid dreaming predicts successful dying. So what
let me see if I can put this in my own way of thinking, so that when you basically connect tantrically and create a black hole or a place where the heavy gravitons exist, you can transport yourself to anywhere in the universe.
Well, I mean, you could say that, but we can be a lot more specific than that. With longitudinal wave interferometry, you can contain heat in plasma remotely at a distance. The Nazi Foo Fighters are examples. Luke Skywalker's sword is an example, and it totally eliminating the need for CERN and atom smashers, because plasma containment is the holy grail of plasma fusion. And if you understand longitudinal microwave interferometry, which is literally a flame in the mind, you understand how you can reconstruct charge compression at a distance. It's literally a projectable hologram. And that we'll get to that when we're talking about how the differential longitudinal beams, when they reconverge at a distance, the longitudinal component is retranslated into transverse electromagnetics, and thus, as a longitudinal, you saw no heat, but when it reconverges at a distance, in the sense of the scalar woodpecker from Tom Bearden, there at that distant point, you then reconverge and heat appears, and it is contained at a distance, even through the steel wall of the fusion reactor, something that the CERN and atom smashers should be embarrassed not to know. But
let me just see if I can wrap my head around this. For me, experientially, I'm a Tantra person, and we have the school of Tantra, and we've been practicing Tantra for over 20 years together and taking thousands of students through these processes. And I've never understood the physics of it. For me, my perception was when I get in a high orgasmic state, and I'm it's sustained for X amount of period, go into timelessness, and that I actually I travel through the universe, and I go past different realms all the way up to source. So am I doing something that relates to what you're saying?
I think that's a beautiful description. And yes, I think we desperately need an electrical engineering for just what you described. And I believe we have it. Specifically, the plasma field of the body becomes tremendously expanded during sexual excitation, which is a root platform also of Kundalini. And we know exactly the power spectra thereof. In my book, on the chapter in the biophysics of Kundalini, we have shown that the low frequency component of the spine liquid pump, the sacrocranial, which is the snake charmer of the Kundalini that delivers the microwave to the high brain, that the sacrocranial low tidals are precisely, or almost precisely, the frequencies of the phase conjugate pump wave called HRV, heart rate variability in the breath. And so you build the snake of the Kundalini up your spine liquid in Kundalini and Tantra. And that, I did the frequency calculations to prove, again, Planck time exponential ratio, phase conjugate pump wave. And then when Bentov, in measuring the physics of Kundalini, documented the ringing in the ears, which you've probably heard during bliss, the ringing in the ears, the so-called sangreal, song in the blood, that he had advanced meditators tune audio oscillators and proved that the ringing in the ears were the natural resonance frequencies of the ventricle cavities of the brain, so-called getting horny. And in my book, you see the chart, and I prove that they also are a negentropic phase conjugate pump wave, all in phase to the HRV. The Meyer wave is also a phase conjugate pump wave, 0.1 hertz. And then the brain waves, ditto. So you have this whole collapsing implosive phase conjugate system, which is then delivering the longitudinal component. Now, if you happen to have a partner, the opposing plasma fields of the two bodies actually conjugate it. And the Anunnaki, the Uru, Draco, actually had a word for this. Enki's mother taught him. And the Tantra School of Los Angeles actually uses my heart tuner to teach this process, because you phase lock the EKGs of people who are lovers, and that increases this micromotion entrainment, sort of the physics of neurolinguistics. And this whole allows the two plasma fields to stand in perfect opposition, implode, and become plasma projective, longitudinal. And if you can ride that wave with the foci of your attention, which is like taking your organs of perception with you when you dream and when you die, it means that plasma field is coherent. That's what we're talking about. So what we're talking about is getting what you're calling a Tantra field, which actually Korotkov measured where, when, and why the ghost aura goes at death. And we know where it goes, why and why it goes there. It goes to the place of charge compression to achieve charge acceleration, to achieve charge distribution. And we also know the sequence of 4 symmetry visions seen during the death experience documented, the Heinrich Kluwe form constants, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. These are actually the sequence of braid operations of DNA that you're seeing during the death visions, because your DNA is preparing your plasma for implosive propagation, this so-called making the L. So,
let me just think about it a little bit more. So you're saying that during the death experience, and a lot of people who have been brought back or they go into hypnosis and they look at the life between lives, they talk about like the tunnel and meeting their guides. Is this what you're talking about? They're actually having some kind of...
Yeah, you can see the animations and the actual documented literature on the geometry of the death visions, the so-called Kluwe map to death, at goldenmean.info/immortality. And we know now why you see this lattice, this cobweb, then a tunnel, then a spiral, because that's the sequence of braid operations of DNA to implode your plasma to the point of conjugation and therefore longitudinal propagation. In other words, ancestral memories exist in a particular kind of electric field, the so-called Hopi Old Oribe burial ground, which is literally a fractal field. So the same electric field that makes a city actually possible, which is, the map of Prague is a rose, is an introduction to why the graveyard and the hospital also must have a charge field that looks like a rose, because only that charge distribution efficiency allows entrance into what was called the collective unconscious or the communion of saints. It's a very particular kind of electric field called phase conjugate or fractal, as introduced in the famous paper on phase conjugate dielectrics called Alice in Barium Titanate Land. And it's why the Hopis were so upset when the U.S. government wanted to put metal pipes in their old Oribe burial ground, because that would literally destroy the presence of their ancestors. And they were correct. And ancestral memory has immense survival value.
So where do we go? Is there a place? Is it physical?
Well,
is it just...
Tonight we wanted to tell a little bit more of the science lesson from the history story, but to briefly answer your question, clearly the only being with enough inertial escape velocity to be a doorway out of the solar system is the heart of the sun. That's the only way to graduate from kindergarten. And the theosophic clairvoyance, psi perception of quarks, and Leadbeater's occult chemistry were quite clear. The heart of the sun, seen clairvoyantly, is an Anu, relates to our Anunnaki story, is an Anu, which is the 7-spin, 5-spin slip knot, which is also the symmetry geometry of human heart muscle and the origin of Hebrew and the braid sequences of DNA and the Ophanim sigil of truth and the Cherokee map. It's all 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, and you can go into that whole story, but it's basically a cubic, tetracubic lattice structure, which is 7 axes of spin symmetry, which is how the heart muscle is layered. And Nassim is right. Then if you jitterbug collapse the ciliated tetra, which is cube octa, into ecosa, that golden path is the structure of the vacuum. And what that collapses into, obviously, is the pent dodeca stellation, 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside. And literally, of course, we know that the thread of DNA is the 5 spins. But when you superpose the braid on the braid and the braid 7 times, then you have 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, and DNA then makes the same slip knot. So the heart of the sun, Anu, says that you can pass if, which is to say if your plasma is projectable, which is to say if the wave mechanics at the center of you as a slip knot are shareable. And the way that's measured is the form of coherence, which is perfect, which is phase conjugate.
Okay. Tosh, any questions, feedback?
No, I'm just tracking you. It's
what we measured in the EKG with my heart tumor invention, we discovered that you could use it very well as a lie detector and a kinesiology measure, because your heart coherence goes up. Your heart sings like a laser only when you speak the truth. And the truth in that sense is defined as a biologically shareable wave called pure intention. And after 1 billion years, the heart of DNA has been gathering those waves in its phase conjugate implosive Holy Communion core, which is a survival library. And so the climax form of coherence, called pure intention, is absolutely measurable. And that's why I'm perhaps a little famous for inventing the concept of heart coherence, because I invented the mathematics for its measurement called a cepstrum. The story's at fractalfield.com/coherence. So heart coherence is the story of how you get on that wave that's projectable through the heart of the sun.
Okay. So back to where you were with the story.
Thank you. Yes. we were trying to tell a story, and we were trying to tell the story of the discovery of the difference in the process by which the human aura, the human can become immortal, which is to say projectable, versus our apparently Draco, Uru, Nephilim, Anunnaki ancestors, and why that makes us a bit unique and perhaps valuable in an intergalactic story of which we're only a tiny little part, but our genetics are interesting. And that difference lies in a difference in blood chemistry, we believe. A good friend of ours, Bill Donovan here, upon studying the ancient history, the Anunnaki story, which you've been working on too, came to the conclusion that for example, if you study the origin of kosher, which we believe that Yahweh Enlil probably had Draco blood, was very concerned that the water be out of his meat. And we now know probably why, because his blood was oil-based. It's a lipid, probably from a methane environment. And we believe from the Roswell and other dissections of the Greys, etc., who are genetically related to Dracos, that the nerves were more silicon-based and the bone was more carbon-based, that they breathed in more nitrogen and out cyanogen, the so-called dragon's breath. And for them, therefore, water is partially a poison. Oxygen is clearly a poison. And so you can tell who's winning the terraforming wars on planets like ours, because if oxygen's going down and carbon dioxide going up, and the other thing that tells you the Dracos are winning is if radioactivity goes up, because they needed that for their bliss process. Let me explain. We believe that from their home star was probably in Alpha Draconis, which at that time was the pole star, and the shape of Alpha Draconis is the Arabic letter L, and you're getting the synergy there. So that star system had a higher gamma ray count, more radioactivity, and that provided them with a form of electron transport in the blood, which is similar to the Paul Brown nuclear battery. Little gamma rays does a lot for electron transport. Anyway, it was a form of their peak perception. And this was good in one sense, but it caused rapid genetic mutation. So the Dracos considered DNA that changed to be defective. And this is the origin of the caste system and Aboriginal marriage law. And it's also called the Monsanto mistake. And so their environment required extreme measures to prevent DNA from changing, which they burnt the genetic symmetry sequences, the so-called old Egyptian language, on copper and gold foil, which the Mormons then read, which were actually genetic records from the Uru, from the Draco, who they called a white salamander, I believe, but we now know there's gold salamanders. It's the shape of plasma beings. So they came here with a very specific genetic problem, the Nephilim, which was loss of long-term memory, loss of ability to project their aura through death, etc. They were living in metal structures. Their aura had stopped becoming projectable. Whereas when they came here, and Enki chose the monkey he chose based on the fact that first time in his life, he saw compassion. The monkey he chose actually had exhibited compassion to other animals, which was shocking to him. And so he had a completely different blood chemistry based on iron, the name of which is called Adom, as in the Adamic race, Adam and Eve, the Hebrew word for red. And the iron-based blood chemistry fascinated him. Whereas theirs was based on a phosphorus, and they had a white Draco and a red Draco because of the white and red phosphorus. Interestingly, even today, there's an example on the planet of a regression mutation in the blood. In Russia, the Iradia couple born too close to Chernobyl, they actually benefit from radioactivity. Mm-hmm. So you see this history of who's terraforming which planet is based on blood chemistry. So their form of bliss was different than our form of bliss. Our form of bliss is enhanced because with iron-based and water-based blood, our DNA can implode in an entirely different way. We know that during human bliss, heart coherence, Glenn Ride made the measure at my suggestion, that phase-coherent EKG causes the DNA to recursively braid implosively. And that coherence event, called a eureka or a bliss implode braids the DNA, and the DNA thickens literally until it turns into a torus, implodes and plasma projectable, and suddenly you're making longitudinal waves in the blood, and your plasma aura is becoming projectable. So human bliss is actually a mechanism for immortality.
Okay, so we no longer have immortality. Somehow it's been genetically blocked by whatever the experiments they did, with the Anunnaki did. They shortened our life expectancy, which was in the thousands of years, and down to 120, but I hardly see anybody that lives to be 120. So how can the Anunnaki and humans mate and reproduce if they are so different? What's going on there?
Well, I believe Ibi Uru, the Hebrews are right. Ibi Uru means crossing over. Ibi, a bird tribe. We know that Thoth Hermes was blue avian, is blue bird-like. David Wilcox says they're returning, and I think that's good. But we believe that the Ibi Uru were crossing over between that blue bird avian and the Uru Draco blood, and that cross, you're right. The Uru Draco, they lived for thousands of years, but their mechanical mechanisms of eliminating the need for death also eliminated what we would call, in some senses, ensoulment. Their genetics were decaying, and they no longer could steer superluminally. In practical terms, that meant the Draco named Charlie, who ran Montauk, he needed the human teenagers because he couldn't steer the time chair himself. In Dune, the kids do not get a good salary if their blood can't steer a superluminal craft. They were immersed, in a vat of gold, which is a high conjugating dielectric, and suddenly they could steer a tornado through the speed of light. And if your DNA is not up to speed to do that, then you don't get good jobs, and your payroll goes down. See, and this is what's meant by a genetic disaster, the Nephilim. The other practical consequence of that genetic disaster was loss of long-term memory and loss of ability to take memory through death. Literally, they forgot. You're right, they didn't have to die, but also, oops, they forgot how. So we were, in a sense, in my view, a vaccine to their Orion Wars, which incidentally was a matriarchy, which accounts very well for why the origin of most every religion on planet Earth is the story of fear of women. I originally got into this study of the extraterrestrial origins of blood because I realized that the universal fear of women at the center of every religion on planet Earth did not originate on planet Earth. And Anton Parks tells that story pretty well. I recommend his Secret of the Dark Stars. You know what the Secret of the Dark Stars is, by the way? This is a spoiler alert now. The Secret of the Dark Stars is that their plasma being ancestors were the dark stars, even the black holes. Inhabiting the heart of a star is a very large interstellar plasma being, and in order to be the plasma that inhabits a black hole, you need a very conjugate centripetal aura. And how do you get your aura that big? Well, hello, let's study our ancestors. That's what he's saying. Literally, the Dragon Queen Mog ancestors were dark stars. Now, this sounds like, maybe physics on the edge.
No, it's the same principle as the sun. You got to go through the
exactly.
place where they're...
Exactly.
Right.
And I point out to the electrical engineers in the audience that on 11 different occasions, it was measured that when millions of children sang the same song at the same moment, that the solar flares were dramatically affected. So we know that stars don't go to so much trouble to make up gene pools like ours for no reason. No, they need what we make, and that is a centripetal force that makes star birth sustainable.
So let me slow this down here. So you're saying that life exists on all levels. We're talking about conscious sentient life. So it can be the size of a wormhole, it can be the size of a star, size of a planet, down to, what is the smallest form of life that holds consciousness?
Well, specifically,
everything?
I have proven that Planck length exponent golden ratio is the structure of hydrogen and therefore DNA, and the cause of gravity and the cause of perception, which is a perfect extension of work that Nassim Haramein started. So what I'm saying is that mind exists everywhere waves phase conjugate, specifically, which is the cause of mass. And we have a new equation which proves even the ratio of mass of the proton to the electron based on that. So the more broad spectral the phase conjugation, the more mindful. And let me give you a practical example. If you take the perfect binaural beat, fractalfield.com/implosion sound, the optimum psychokinetic binaural beat, and you do that in even more broad spectral phase conjugation from ELF sonic all the way up to microwave in an optical conjugate noble gas, which is our Prairie device, which does time reversal, age reversal, it does cancer remission, all this cool stuff. The Prairie device, the prototype, is now clinical testing in 3 countries. The more broad spectral that phase conjugation, the more self-aware, the more it is a Kundalini trigger, the more it is literally the flame in the mind. A practical example, when at a certain time of year in the temple in Jerusalem, and it also happens in an island in Greece, this cold plasma appears when the priest does the exact correct prayer in the stone cavern, which we now know is an archaeoacoustic conjugator. This plasma appears, and every flame in the room lights immediately, and it's a cold fire that does not burn, and everyone is healed. You know what that is? That is a conjugate broad spectral plasma field. Yes, it's spiritual, and yes, it's beautiful physics.
Wow. So I need to get you working with Dr. Aubrey de Grey, because he's working on the, physical mortality, Methuselah projects, and you probably have a key that he's been looking for, and they're working on, reversing aging and, physical immortality, basically, and all the problems that might, around sort of solving that, because then what do you do with our population? But that will probably resolve itself, because we'll live longer, be more conscious, and be more, spiritually advanced and wise, hopefully, and make better choices about how to treat our planet. But back to this. Okay, you were starting to say we have to study our ancestors. Address that and after that. Go ahead.
Well, I was just, with regard to what you just said, physics is clear about the nature of time reversal in phase conjugates, in that you can only time reverse back to a more ordered state, meaning you can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but not the reverse. And where this then applies to your aura is that if you live in a building made of biologic material, which have higher dielectric constant, and not in a building made of steel and aluminum, this means your aura has more opportunity to implode and conjugate. It literally means you can project your plasma through it and unpack. A practical example, when Steiner said the children in the Waldorf school must only touch living material, wood and stone and natural fabric, and should never touch plastic or metals, what he meant was that only in those environments is their aura able to non-destructively unpack. And literally, as we know from Celestine prophecy, all human interactions about charge. And what that means is that you can't have charge distribution in a structure made of a biologically poisonous material like steel or aluminum. The physics is that when you watch, if you put a seed in a steel or aluminum cup, you can watch it die. And the physics of why it dies is because the capacitance of that cup is the opposite of harmonic inclusive. In other words, there's only one or two harmonics there. So it is the opposite of charge distribution efficiency. Whereas if you put the same seed in a wooden or a stone cup, high dielectric, paramagnetic, etc., the seed will blossom beautifully. So this tells you that you do not want to send your child to a steel or aluminum school. It also tells you that if a person claims to be a biology teacher and they're doing it in a steel and aluminum building, you know they're not a biology teacher because they don't know what life is.
Wow. And that's why people get sick when they go to Costco and Walmart. All those boxes, they just make you sick.
Well, and we need to extend that further to the environment that makes attention possible is the environment that makes life possible. So if you remove the poisonous fluorescent lights from your child's school and install sunlight, you measure a dramatic increase in attention span. It's proven physics, John Ott's book, Health and Light. The physics of why is because the harmonic content of sunlight is a conjugator, which is the physics of the wave which makes attention possible, which is to say simply makes charge able to be centripetal. So the very nature of attention, which is called phase conjugation, is the nature of life. So you can design an environment that makes life possible, and a metal school full of dead air and electrosmog, and a metal hospital, these are the opposite of life, and this is a sin against all of life.
Wow. You know, this. I know you live in the Pyrenees. One of my teachers, Angeli Arian, says that the Basque tradition, she's a shaman, is just for health to spend at least 3 hours outdoors without any structures over or around you.
Yeah, and in fact, in the Jasmine tradition of people learning to live without food, and we know many people who are quite vibrant, that you spend a certain number of hours. Actually, you need to spend that time almost barefoot, or the bottoms of your shoes are a conjugator like leather or something, so that you can absorb the charge, and then you're on rock or on dirt that has the capacitance of the Schumann. And so when you're barefoot in grounded, and the earthing movement is access to ground, which is access to a fractal, your aura has a chance to absorb charge. And we know, there's hundreds of documented examples in history of people living to be hundreds of years old, yogis, and not one of them did it in a metal building.
Right. Well, I was reading the earthing information that said you can reverse a lot of damage by getting out there and putting your feet in the earth.
Yes. And the
so
physics
do it every day.
The physics of that explains why the amount of disease, if you live over the third floor of a building, is exponentially higher. Architects don't want you to know that, but the physics is that living high up in a building is schizophrenic in the sense that it disconnects you from the Schumann harmonic series, and therefore the phase conjugate pump wave that is the Earth's collective mind.
So only on the first floor.
Well, the issue would be if you made a magnetic map of the foundation of your house. If there was a burning fountain present, you had access to the bloodstream of the Earth. Conversely, of course, if you sleep over a water vein, your aura will want to go with it, and that isn't so good either.
Say it again. If you sleep over a water vein, what happens?
Yeah, a good architect actually makes the building in such a way that the walls are over the water vein underground to prevent people from sitting and lying on a water vein, because if you measure your aura as you walk over a water vein, it collapses for the same reason that if you drive your car past a running river, every child in the car suddenly needs to pee.
Oh, I see.
Well, in a way, it's sort of like the myelin sheath that surround our neurons. That the ancient sacred sites would have a series of berms around them to regulate the energy that flowed through the water, to make sure that the water was flowing in ways that didn't disrupt the kind of coherence that the temple and its structure could bring to the people that were in it, so the structure of their blood would replicate it and they would be coherent.
Well, that's a very useful language, yes, but I would add to that the material of those walls would need to be of a high dielectric material, ultimately conjugators, that achieves not just the layering but the cocooning, which makes the inner cavity implosive. In the same way, a layer of monoatomic materials can make a hyperbaric chamber healing, or the conjugate noble gases in the Prairie device. So we know what the layers need to be, and in fact, that says more than about the myelin sheath in Lorenzo's oil. It says that the myelin is not just the perfect insulator, but when the insulator is of a high enough dielectric constant, it's a capacitor as a bell that is by definition a 0-point coherence.
Yes, I understand.
So we
have like 2 minutes before the break, so let's maybe talk about something that will have a logical conclusion. We can back after the break with the rest of it.
I think in the first half, our happily ever after is supposed to be that, according to Anton Parks, and I sort of agree, that the human genetic diversity was cooked up in such a way that we could be a vaccine for the Orion Wars and thus have value, even though our technology is childish. And that vaccine is that we can craft a form of coherence in the aura that they could not. Example, of all the humans that the Greys did abductions for in the U.S., a huge majority of them were lucid dreamers. Many were indigenous. They could lucid dream, and therefore they were important because they could phase coherent aura, similar to the teenagers that were used to steer the time chair at Montauk. So this is our part one, that we can make an aura that's plasma projective, that is to say coherent bliss, become lucid dreamers in a way they could not, and take memory through death in a way they could not. In part two of this story, we will get to their use of language.
Very good. Perfect timing. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Most guys freeze. That's your cerebral cortex looking for an answer it doesn't have.
See? Even your brain knows you're screwed.
The body is filled with adrenaline right now, whether you know it or not. The heart's beating fast. It's getting a little harder to breathe. The neurobiological system is telling it to run, but your knees are too weak to move.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity. Do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. We are all telling ourselves a story.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. 100% listener-supported radio. Reporting from danger. Unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio!
Tune in Tuesdays at 12 noon Eastern on Studio A to hear Tammy Adams share her knowledge of an unknown realm on Talking with Your Angels. Join Tammy as she uncovers hidden secrets about the spiritual world of angels, ghosts, and other entities that have been with us longer than we know. Tammy is a psychic, a teacher, spiritual coach, a leader in her field, and will be sharing her information and stories with you. So join us on Tuesdays at noon on Studio A. With Tammy's guidance, you'll find out who has been watching over you from the other side, and soon you will be talking with your angels.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com with your host, Janet Lesson and Dr. Sasha Lesson, and our very special guest, Dan Winter. But before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to the donation button on the freedomslips.com website and make a donation. $1, $5, $10, $15, $20, whatever you can donate is greatly appreciated. And we here at Revolution Radio appreciate your donation because it allows everyone here to bring us these shows like ours and all the others on Revolution Radio. And we do appreciate your donation. Thank you very much. Dr. Lesson, are you back with us?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. You got back. I have a question before we, or to the second part of the show. We were talking about the...
Wait, Jen, you got to ask for contributions.
I did. You missed that.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't get to the time. Okay.
Okay. So we were talking about how humans are a vaccine for the Orion Wars. So I want to go into that. What are the Orion Wars, and how are we being used as a vaccine for what purpose? And also, Dan, I wanted you to maybe explain us a little bit. You've researched all kinds of different researchers in history and theories on the alien-human interaction in the universe and creation, et cetera, et cetera. What made you converge on Anton Park's work, and how did you decide that his work is more true or whatever over anybody else's? And because I know you probably have a logic behind why you're aligning with that theory over others. Back to you, Dan.
Well, it was sort of interesting that after many years of pretty intense Kundalini experiences, myself, I ended up writing a small book about Enki, goldenmean.info/Enki. And later then, also after intense Kundalini kinds of experiences, Anton Parks writes a book about Enki. And why is that? I think because when you get back to the roots of the plasma flame that is our collective racial memory, you get to that major turning point. I also think that Anton Parks demonstrated after he kind of downloaded, I like to joke, he downloaded Enki's iPhone. It was really his voice crystal called a Girku, that he did amazing historical research, even transcending in many ways, I think, what Edmund O'Brien did and Sitchin did in showing the historical accuracy of that work. But again, it's the science lesson that I think is compelling here. For example, he is describing the point of plasma projection we call temple. He calls it Stargate, or the technical term was Dharana. An example, Uru Asa Elen, Jerusalem, Uru, dragon blood, Asa, queen of, El, again, the place of the phase shift or plasma projection. And so the war was over the Stargate. Of course, Jerusalem as a Stargate is broken. But the point was that if you get a soul group together, able to collectively lucid dream together, which is to say to have a collective bliss experience, they could potentially project their collective plasma field through the heart of a star, through the sun. Mm-hmm. And that's what Akhenaten's job was when he failed to finish Amarna and changed his name to Moses and became a gold powder cook. But so that I think Anton Parks has done a pretty good job with that story. And incidentally, my view on that blood chemistry story and the rest of it, you can see much more detail at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And there was one particular part of that story that I forgot to tell, which was that couple things. One, we now believe that the core science that is the Hermetic science, symbolized by caduceus, we now know that's a wave shape of conjugation, that skill was the ability to make a bioactive field, like the Dolichocephalics who built the archaeoacoustics under Malta at Hypogeum. The structures like that, I think it was the NERA, New England Antiquities Research Society, they concluded that these stone berms, they were not built for food storage. They were not built to live in. They made a whole list of things they were sure they were not. What they didn't know was these were devices to save a civilization by saving agriculture by learning to do pulse geometry seed treatment. This is what Burke and Levengood documented in the book Seeds of Knowledge, and Nancy Talbot heroically financed, and they even know the exact number of minutes and the geometry of the wave pulse to increase seed growth by 30 to 50%. Now we're doing that hydrodynamically.
Well, you know that the same thing goes for humans in the temples of Inanna, like at Uruk. The idea was for couples to make a baby in the temple in a meditative state, often with other people coherently meditating with them and making this child.
Excellent point. Very good point. Yes, that the plasma containment that becomes implosive is immortalizing and essential to life. And you're right. Not only did these implosive plasma containment devices, the ancient temple, the real Hermetic science, like Stonehenge, not only did they save agriculture at the time of starvation with seed treatment and life-generating field effects, but they saved the shaman's ability to plasma project and therefore communicate with ancestors. And that bliss process was also essential to successful birth and death, and you're right, successful fertilization. So absolutely, bioactive field construction was essential and the essence of what Hermetic science was. And it's precisely what we need to have to save our civilization, how to make an immortalizing field. So
when they were doing these rituals where they had groups all converging on this conception of the child, what I've read somewhere and got somewhere is that they were not only trying to make successful conception, but they were bringing in a certain soul, like soul transference. They wanted to have a particular soul come into the fetus. Have you heard anything about that?
They could direct the plasma, even like the correct tubes out the pyramids pointed to Sirius at the right time. And by the way, you don't want to do that at the wrong phase of the moon, because the moon is opposite to a conjugator. Not only do you need to avoid the moon in order to have a seed germinate, but you also need to avoid the moon to have a human germinate properly.
You know, in the story of Nimma, Ningishita, and Enki making the Adamu, they chanted very much like Emoto's people chant beside the lake to clarify the lake. They were chanting to direct the seed to be a human being that could speak and hold his urine.
Mm-hmm. And good, that's where we wanted to go in this segment, was their use of sacred alphabets as symmetry instructions for conjugate implosion. But so that's right where we'll go in that next part here. But before I do, there was one more thing that I was supposed to tell in part one, and that is, remember when I said their blood was lipid oil, they breathed in nitrogen and out cyanogen, and oxygen was a poison. For example, if you pump oxygen in where you think you have parasites, like in the U.S. Senate, no, I'm joking, or not. But anyway, if you think you have plasma parasites, so the Orion Wars were called the Oxygen Wars, and now it's becoming evident why, because of the difference in blood chemistry. But the other thing was carbon, bone, and silicon nerve. Now, which we know from the Roswell dissections. The silicon nerve meant higher wave propagation velocities in the nervous tissue. And you know what that meant? It meant higher frequency EEG power spectra. Their brain waves had higher frequency components, but did not have the lower frequency components. You know what that means? That means more telepathy and less empathy. Mm-hmm. That's very heavy, because we know from the Phil Schneider transcripts from the firefight under Dulce, etc. These were highly telepathic. And the Tibetan gamma, 44 hertz, highly telepathic. Well, what happens if you have brainwave frequencies that are higher is, telepathy works a lot better. But why does that inhibit empathy? And this is important.
Yes, good question.
Because they're removed from their kinesthetic awareness, which is greater on the lower chakras.
Well, yes, you could talk about it as lower chakras, but what we're referring here is to the ELF component of the phonon resonance, like the below 20 hertz stuff. And below 20 hertz, their brain waves don't get there. And you know what lives below 20 hertz? Waves that are very big. Waves that are the size of planets. The really long waves do not embed in their brainwaves. That means they don't feel planetary events like we can. We can reach and embed in planetary structures because we can embed in very long waves, and they can't. And empathy is that. It is the ability to embed in the other as a complete whole long wave. And so the inhibition of empathy in their brainwave physics was a profound difference. The story, I was there at when Barbara Marciniak had the Dracos, Orion Queen Moggs. They would embed their plasma in the pregnant women. And one of the ancient Orion Queen Moggs, thousands of years old, shocks her contemporaries by deciding to experiment with dying after learning what it felt like to be a human mother nursing, because, of course, she hadn't had that feeling, but it was to feel a very long wave. And that ability to embed, which really defines empathy and compassion, is a fundamental difference between the Draco chemistry and our own.
So were these Dracos, are dragons real? You were talking about dragons earlier, and I've read that the dragons actually, and they're not real, but they're real beings. Go ahead.
Empathy is a function of oxygen, you're saying. Empathy is a function of available oxygen.
Well, you get a different quality flame metabolically with an oxygen metabolism. And one of its capabilities was a lower frequency in the brainwave, but that also has to do with the fact that our nerves have much less silicon, and therefore we have lower propagation velocities, so we can support longer waves in our nerves as well. But there's other aspects to the oxygen breather that's different than the nitrogen breather, and this is fundamental to the nature of the Orion Wars. And it has to do with plasma density, which we can have much greater in humans. Actually, Kundalini is simply a maximization of plasma density, plasma fire, which is why it's measurable in the microwave. But we can't go there in this conversation at that moment. Where we can go now is the description of the origin of sacred language in their genetics versus ours. And that's where we can take this to a practical understanding of psychokinesis and magic and spells and that sort of thing.
Cool. Go for it.
Yeah. We know that, and I did the mathematics, that if you take this, if you study the Vedas and how the Vimana flew, they were pumping high inertial mercury on a very precise spiral on a torus, on a donut. And that angle, called translation of vorticity, we spoke about that spiral on the torus, translates rotational inertia into linear inertia, and it's the ultimate form of propulsion. It's how you steer your aura, and NASA desperately needs to know. So when the Nazis were studying, they learned that if you mix an iron powder with a wetting agent with that mercury, as you pump it in that spiral on the torus, the amount of gravity you make is exponential. This was the purple liquid in the Nazi bell, the Glocke. And and this is plasma projection par excellence, because this is how you make gravity. It is highly efficient propulsion physics. You can see the Navier-Stokes equation for that spiral on the torus to optimize in the PDFs at fractalfield.com/propulsion. So why am I saying that about origin of language? Because I wrote the equation to geometrically, topologically superpose that golden spiral on the torus in the accurate projection angle, and proved that the shadows of that golden spiral on that torus, simply viewed from the perspective of the 7 arrows of the tetra we spoke about, those shadows are Hebrew and Sanskrit. And the animations are at goldenmean.info/DNA ring. And we know that these spirals on the side of the gold ring is the origin of Lord of the Ring. And in fact, this was the Elvic Finnish Ugaric that Tolkien used. And, this is how the ring fused. And if you had this, the ring could be one. Well, the Lord of the Ring is the one who can identify with the plasma at the center of that fusion device. And let me give you an example. So if you take the sequence of views of that spiral in the torus, if you look at that torus from the outside, the shadow of that spiral is the Hebrew letter Bet, and you walk 1/7 the way towards center and look again at center, and the next letter is Resh, etc. And when you're finished, you're on the inside looking out, and the shadow view from there is H, and the word you've spelled is Bereshith, the first word of Genesis, mistranslated in the beginning, true meaning from Faber d'Olivet, at first, in principle, the origin of thingness, which is simply the sequence of turns of mind necessary to turn inside out on the surface of a torus, which is how matter is created. You tie the slip knot. So when you hold a Hebrew letter in your mind, you're shaping the angle of the toroid donut of the charge field of the optical cortex of your brain, like blowing a smoke ring, and you're controlling the angle of that smoke ring. Now, imagine you're dead or you're dreaming. Korotkov has measured the plasma field which you are as a ghost. It's very measurable. We know why ghosts show up where the temperature goes down, because they suck in the heat. and these are plasma projections. So when you're lucid dreaming or when you're dead, how do you steer?
Right.
You got an astronaut's problem. You got your vector jets going in all directions. How are you going to steer? You have this problem of the hero of the movie Ghost. You get your coherent emotion, but how are you going to blow that penny? And
intentionality.
So how do you steer? Is that the same as when you're out of body? How do you
yes,
steer?
exactly. Yeah.
Because when I'm out of body, I tend to I imagine, angling to the right, and that propels me forward to the right. It's like all in my mind. But I actually I can't translate it, but I actually can, through thought, create this motion. And then I fly.
It's good to recognize that what you're calling your mind is quite literally a plasma tornado. And your ability to give a tornado direction is, it's rather like let's call it an angelic ritual. If we look at how in a ritual you have maybe a priest visualizing exactly opposing Hebrew letters, say Yod He Vav He or Adonai, the 4 opposing letters. And so on the one side of the room, someone holds a Hebrew letter in their mind, shapes a tornado at a particular tilt angle, and then blows that smoke ring toward the center of the room, while the person on the exact opposite side, 4-wave mixing phase conjugate, visualizes the opposing letter Yod He Vav or Adonai or Agla, as in the Ophanim Enochian. And I have seen these rituals create so much magnetic wind at the center of the room. The joke is they blow the doors off the temple. It's actually true that air pressure changes in the room. And I have seen storms the size of continents fabricated. And this is the mythology that becomes Shakespeare's The Tempest. We know that John Dee who had spent his youth studying how mirrors could conjugate a plasma to conjure. And he was aware that the Western world would spend the rest of the century in the Inquisition if the Spanish Armada won. He spent a year and he fabricated a plasma storm. The meteorology of the storm that took out the Armada from the North Sea had never before or since happened in history. And this was a plasma being the size of stars called Ophanim Enochian. You can read the whole story at goldenmean.info/Ophanim.
But the implication is that you can deconjugate a storm just as well as create it.
Well, yes, that's right. You can anti-conjugate. That's the point. Yes. The issue is that large plasma beings are frustrated that humans don't steer them because they think we are drunk. We take the example of the California drought. Michael Sarian believes that John Dee was evil because he wanted to play with angels the size of stars. Now, if you look at plasma-universe.org, you realize that physicists are quite clear what angels are. They're self-organizing plasma beings the size of stars. And they have certain symmetry dynamics, which is called angel alphabets. And John Dee had the largest library on the planet in his day, and his specialty was the mathematics of the hypercube. You know what the hypercube is? It's this stellation of a tetrahedron cube octet, which jitterbugs to icosahedrodeca, geometry of DNA, how you conjugate. And so he actually discovered the superset symmetry from Hebrew, which is Ophanim Enochian, which we believe is the roots of Greek. You can see the whole thing there. It's how to call plasma beings, which are very big, because we have a relationship to them which is necessary. And if we don't use that relationship, we deserve that our climate should go into chaos. So I would call a California drought, for example, biofeedback, because if you don't know how to magnetically attract rain, then you don't deserve it.
So what could they do in California as a group to bring in water?
Well, let me give you an example. I taught one of my advanced courses at a place called Trimurti on the Mediterranean there. It's a famous retreat center. And we had a bunch of French people come together to build a labyrinth in an area where that hadn't been done for centuries. And they built that, you very accurately map the magnetic cross point, the dimpling point, the JED, and then you install a 7-turn Cretan-Minoan labyrinth, which is a magnetically implosive device. And if you do it with enough passion, all of the elementals in the area want to run right over and play because, they've been bored and lonely for centuries. Well, what happened that night was the largest storm that hit that area for a decade. I mean, it was a rip-roaring storm. And it wasn't me that did that, but the locals, having participated in a collectivizing emotion, which is the ultimate in touch permissive making implosion. So labyrinth building is an example of what California desperately needs. But what they really desperately need is to recognize that if you don't talk to your elementals, they're going to get mad. And I don't blame them. I mean, you drive across those plains of California where there hasn't been a coherent magnetic line in decades. I mean, nobody's playing with the elementals. So I don't blame them. If I were a water vapor droplet, I wouldn't want to fall on California because I know that I would die as a water vapor droplet because there's nothing to precipitate.
Wow.
The magnetic map has got...
So the Native Americans were right to play with it.
Well, the magnetic map ultimately must look like a rose. And if you have large metal cities, they obviously are going to prevent rain. I recommend the California people study James DeMayo's paper, Desertification and Patriarchy, which proves dramatically that the spread of patriarchy profoundly maps the spread of the Sahara Desert. Well, the physics is that if you watch a child focus their attention in a cloud, and that child is grounded and blissful, any child can put a hole in that cloud. Sure. The physics is that because focused human attention is electrically centripetal, as Bill Tiller proved in his book, Conscious Active Creation from Stanford Physics. So what is going to make holes in clouds is electrically centripetal force. It's capacitive fractality, which is what cloud seeding silver iodide does, but more so it is the actual cone most effective as capacitor in Trevor Constable's Weather Engineering in the High Seas from William Reich. The cone that was most effective as capacitor was a 60-degree cone, which happens to be the imploder.com, our implosion cone there, which was implosive capacitance, the opposite of what you get over polluted electrosmog metal cities, which prevent water vapor from learning how to touch or share space. So it's simple. The principle Christos, crystallization, is the principle of learning how to share electrically. And you can't do that if the charge doesn't look like a rose.
Wow. So getting the people to sing and pray and meditate together with good intentions of harmony with the planet without any things that spoil the transmission seems to be an answer.
Well, coherent magnetic mapping, every time a highway cuts a major magnetic line, the Earth becomes more and more like a desert. It's sort of like Camelot. Another practical example would be when Phil Callahan proved that when magnetic lines are broken, and you measure it with paramagnetism in the soil, you can predict where war will break out. goldenmean.info/Peace University. So when Village A and Village B's magnetic line is cut, they make war because obviously the dreaming and the emotion between the villages can't touch. Well, they furthered that study and mapped that during war, underground water disappeared. And they actually did the work to document how to bring back the underground water. They did this in Vukovar, I think Yugoslavia, which the underground water veins had literally disappeared during the war. And the women went there and they built labyrinths and, did the touch permissive and they literally imploded the underground water veins back to the surface. The legend is that the Cistercian cathedrals are built over the cistern, but what they don't know is a well-built cathedral can make an underground spring.
Oh, they found the same kind of thing in that pyramid that this guy built in Chicago, and suddenly there's water around, and then he's on an island in a lake that's growing bigger and bigger and bigger.
That's right. Anything that makes the charge centripetal. Obviously, forests are very good at attracting rain, but a city that's well designed, for example, Prague, which is very good at attracting people and tourists and money. The original magnetic map of Prague is quite literally a rose. And we personally found the lucid dreaming there was much better. So, California needs to take a lesson from urban design and magnetic mapping. We put a lot of that information at goldenmean.info/rain about attracting rain.
That's good.
Wow.
I hope they can solve their problems. Wow. Okay, so where do you go next?
Well, also I get that as you are looking through using the Hebrew letters to basically map your way to the spiral, you're really giving yourself multidimensionality, and that the mathematics and the geometry that you generate, those are just drawings of what's actually happening when you create this coherence, and the more people that you get involved in it, the more it amplifies, if I understand you.
Yeah, that the actual spiral on the torus, which casts the shadow called a Hebrew letter, is a tetrahedral index. Now, if you take the crownlet or the tagin, which are the three arrows the rabbi puts above the Hebrew letter, which indicate your angle in the tetracube, and you remove those and instead put a vertical and horizontal bar to index your relative angle with respect to tetracube, then you have Sanskrit. So the physics was that you were creating a tetracubic lattice structure for charge domain donuts, and the superset of that, the hypercube, is what the higher order languages like Ophanim, Enochian, and probably Greek, etc. And that's where you get the completion of the conjugate structure. But the point was, you're just learning to throw donuts around, and that's the only subject called physics. Wormhole, string theory, vortex. That's the only thing physics has to discuss. So if, in fact, you could steer one tornado, you could steer everything that physics has ever named. And if you ever watched a shaman steering a tornado, step one, he says, I'm eating the hucha. And by the hucha, he means I'm eating the anger. And by that, he means I'm feeling the pain of that tornado better than it feels its own pain. And remember, the only definition of pain is where the fractality bleeds charge. And so the part of the tornado's vorticity, which is bleeding, if the shaman feels that pain, then the tornado, more than metaphorically, recognizes that embedding its center of gravity in the shaman's center of gravity will increase its immortality, and therefore the tornado follows the shaman around like a pet puppy, sort of like Sorcerer's Apprentice. But if you were watching clairvoyantly, you would see the bioplasmic streamers of the shaman's plasma body embed and become the center of gravity of the tornado. And what you need to know is that the center of lowest pressure is what the tornado always follows. It's pure physics. And where is the center of lowest pressure? The place which is most conjugate.
So the tornadoes always go towards the mobile home park for some reason.
Well, the human consciousness.
Well, that's the joke.
Human consciousness.
The joke is that the tornado will go out of its way to destroy metal buildings like a trailer park. And what that means is the metal buildings feel like pain to that tornado because, being opposite to conjugate, they prevent the breathing of charge, and therefore they're the opposite of its electrical body. Whereas, so they need destroying because they are the pain. Versus an ancient stone temple, the tornado always avoids destroying the ancient stone temple because the plasma there is profoundly conjugate. So it feels like part of the body of the tornado.
Wow.
You know that in the old houses in Switzerland, there's always a hole in the roof so that grandma can go out when she dies. And it points somewhere, the same as the tubes out of the pyramids, So it is about plasma projection.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that they put a hole in the roof so grandma has a place to escape when she dies to go through?
Yeah. That's tradition in Switzerland, yes.
In Switzerland. Wow.
This tells you something about why a metal roof inhibits lucid dreaming, because your plasma is not projectable very well. Whereas if your house is built of all biologic material, high dielectric constant, which is the same should be true of your clothing. And this creates a way that your plasma, your charge, your aura can breathe into, embed, and become projectable. Essentially, the physics, we call it high dielectric, of living architecture is simple. Every molecule that joined the attractive club called life gets rearranged into greater fractality, which is charge distribution efficiency. It's sort of like Albert Szent-Györgyi getting some kind of Nobel Prize in biophysics in his book Electronic Biology and Cancer, when he discovered that the water in a healthy cell must be more orderly than ice. And when that water order breaks down, it's called cancer, because the triplet state electron cannot achieve charge distribution efficiency. So the real issue is simply the fractality called high dielectric of charge distribution efficiency, which in the case of water is a crystal more orderly than ice. It's also why pine needles turn brown in acid rain, because there's no trace mineral to organize the water.
So what can you do to get cancer?
Well, if you look at the Priory device, the plasma conjugate implosive device, which we now have a working prototype. It was documented by the French government to have healed hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of cancer. Cancer, in a literal sense, is a failure of centripetal force. Take this example. If you want to measure how cancerous a cell is, besides the bioelectronics of Vincent, where you document the electrical terrain, pH, redox, and resistance, the way you measure it classically is the more spherical a cell is, the more cancerous. And why is a spherical cell a failure of centripetal force? Because it's the opposite of plasma projective. You know, when Bucky Fuller designed the geodesic dome, they were actually geopathic. They were metal and spherical. They were quite geopathic. But the fact is, a healthy cell is actually egg-shaped because that's plasma projective. And you get that voltage difference end to end, which is why an egg makes voltage from gravity. And that makes it plasma projective. Because here is how a cell works. A cell takes the highest frequency, it's literally the sex juice of a cell, the highest coherence optics of the cell is a coherent ultraviolet blue fire. It's literally UV coherence. And that is the driver for all cellular biophysics. And when enough of that arrives at the center of the cell says, oops, okay, I have to divide now because I have to do something with my sex juice. and which is just like a teenager. If you give them dance and music and arts and creativity, they don't get promiscuous. But if they have no way to distribute their sex juice, well, yes, they're going to have babies as teenagers. So in the living cell, the ultraviolet has to have a place to go. And if this cell is egg-shaped, it's plasma projective. And the membrane will then be permissive to transmitted ultraviolet. And this is why contact inhibition defines cancer. Because if the ultraviolet has some place to go in that contact, then the cell doesn't have to divide prematurely. So ultraviolet distribution determines cancer versus non-cancer, and that is what is plasma projective through the egg-shaped membrane. Now, the next step of that is if you gather that ultraviolet, at the tailbone you have Tantra and Kundalini. And this is what the blue fire of Kundalini is. And you can actually measure that ultraviolet going up the spine liquid pumped by the ELF of the sacrocranial titles. And the frequency signature of that is in my book for Kundalini as being a precise phase conjugate pump wave. And this then delivers that ultraviolet to the high brain, which makes a cornucopia of the ventricles become horny. And the brain then becomes plasma projective in Kundalini, and that's why Moses and Lucifer had horns.
Oh, that's why they had horns. I have a question. You wrote that one sacred space is physics, and you see 3 ways electrical engineers measure that at goldabeam.info/architecture. Then birth and death and graveyard design become a solvable electrical engineering problem, precisely as Hermes Stock would have taught. Can you explain how we can solve birth, death, and graveyard? Is birth, death, and graveyard design?
If you look at the altar at Machu Picchu, it's an implosive plasma projector. And as you yourself said, if the electrical environment is implosive, successful birth and death are possible. So, first of all, the 3 ways we show to measure sacred space, one is Karatkov's GDV, and the other is my biophoton technique, goldabeam.info/biophoton, or we use a brainwave microvolt spectrum analyzer to measure life force. And there's a 3rd way, which we use hemp fibers to measure a tree capacitively. So we can measure whether an electrical environment is implosive and therefore alive, which is fractal. The 3rd way is actually can be simplified as after the architect builds a building, you measure the ability of the electrical center of that building to cause a seed to germinate. And that's what determines the architect's paycheck. If the building is made of steel and aluminum, it will prevent seed germination because the environment will not be centripetal. So this is the biologic architecture, which is now, it's a curriculum which is sweeping the world. This is taking over. In Mexico, goldenmean.info/architecture has become psychogeometria.com, PSI. And that is this biologic architecture is taking over the world. We are now doing temple designs for Christians and Muslims based on the physics of capacitance. So if you can build implosive capacitance, which is to say a bioactive field, then you can be an architect. But first you'll have to know what life is, which is an electric field that's centripetal. It's simple. A seed germinates if it can suck in its first nutrient. Otherwise, the seed is dead. How does the seed get the electric field necessary to suck its first nutrient, life or death for a seed? That is to say, become centripetal or get dead.
Sunshine kisses it.
Well, yes, but that's why a certain frequency signature, an electrical pulse which is implosive, is so dramatically 30 to 50% increase in growth, effective for seed germination. And this will be the next job of our Prairie pulse field, which we're now using for cancer and other things. But it will also be an extension of what Levengood and Burke did in the book Seeds of Knowledge with Nancy Talbot. So, but to finish your question, then graveyard design and hospice or hospital design for successful death is literally fractalfield.com, which is to say how to build a fractal field. A charge map which invites embedding and charge distribution. Here's a practical example. A surgeon who wrote the original article on the physics of pain, being fractal charge bleeding, goldenmean.info/pain, he was the lead anesthesiology teacher at New Jersey Institute of Technology Medical School. And he did an experiment that if you take paramagnetic stones and you lay them out in the geometry of a boat, which is how shaman begin plasma projection, and you put that around the operating table in a surgery, he measured a dramatic reduction in surgery recovery times if the surgery was done on a bed in the center of a stone circle. Wow. Now, the physics is that, look, during anesthesia, your plasma center exits your body. But if you're doing the surgery in the center of a stone circle, the reason recovery time is reduced is because your plasma can return to your body more centripetal and it isn't so disconnected. It's the same reason why if you do not use anesthesia, you always heal faster. It's the same reason why the north pole of a magnet, while it will reduce pain because it's centrifugal, the south pole of a magnet, which increases pain, also increases the healing rate of the toothache. Well documented.
So the failure to put stones around the operating table would be increasing a person's risk factors, and a hospital should recognize that it's liable for its patient's health by putting them in a metal operating situation.
Yeah, the metal room with all the electrosmog is obviously fatal for surgery and birth and death process. But, there's lots of ways to make that field centripetal. A stone circle is pretty antiquated. Actually, plasma tube geometry, which is what the Prairie is, would be the elegant. And, that device, it looks like it's right out of Star Trek. You got these two plasma fields with this cone of fire coming to make a cold blue flame in the center. I mean, that thing is so cool. And if you rearrange those things around the room, obviously, you have the ultimate ritual space, the Kundalini igniter. It's a sham.
What do they cost? How much are they?
Well, we're doing initial installs in 3 countries, and I'm not at liberty to reveal cost information at this moment. But clearly this technology, we have ownership and control in Brazil and Canada and Australia, and it's so international that no country will prevent it.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
But it's not prohibitive.
Well, no, it is obviously not illegal to make a plasma glow, and we have the spectrum analyzers that prove that the frequency content is non-ionized. It's not. It's far lower threshold than any X-ray, so we can prove that this is not destructive. So obviously, it's not illegal to expose your body to a light bulb. Hello, the FDA has nothing to say about what we're doing.
Great.
Wow.
But I'm saying not that it was not prohibitive. I'm saying prohibited. It's not prohibitive. The cost isn't so huge as to make it impractical.
Well, I mean, right now, Prairie spent millions building these devices, decades ago, because that's what it costs to build high voltage power supplies for plasma tubes with low frequency embedded conjugate waveforms. It turns out the frequency he used fit the equation on the cover of my book, but he didn't know there was an equation for it, of course, because he didn't know what phase conjugation was. But now that we do, we can build this thing for a fraction of what he was spending, on the order of, $10,000 to $50,000 for prototypes, and eventually this, and now our electronics is the size of a small fridge, but eventually this will be the size of a portable computer. You'll make light bulbs that conjugate. As I was explaining, when you put the frequencies of sunlight replacing the poisonous fluorescence in your child's classroom, you're doing some of the same thing. You're creating a conjugate optical waveform. Now, if you modulate that conjugate optics with broad spectral conjugation right down to the ELF, the Schumann cascade, etc., that's what a cold fire is. That's what the fire that did not consume, or the cold flame. This is an ancient tradition. It's simply also now modern physics.
So what kind of bulbs are the light of the sun rather than this, what we have currently? Are there any bulbs in the market you could put in your house that are better?
It's called full spectrum lighting. It was called GE Chroma 50. John Ott, Health and Light, wrote about this. And full spectrum lighting is very famous. Actually, my father in the family business in Buffalo, New York, at my suggestion, installed full spectrum lighting instead of the warm and cool fluorescence. And not only is there a dramatic reduction in absenteeism and employee health issues, but there was a dramatic increase in business.
Amazing, yeah.
But they used to say, they work so hard and expensive to imitate sunlight. But even that isn't the issue. What we need to imitate is pure phase conjugation. And now we know what that is, and that's the light Prairie used. It is a pure conjugate implosion. It's Planck length and time exponent golden ratio phase conjugate, pure non-destructive charge collapse. It's the reason gravity exists. It's the reason mass exists. It's the reason charge compression exists. And it's the reason perception exists.
Well, that's why we run out of Walmart. Lighting sucks. You don't want to stay in there long with you. And that hurts some people.
That's true. And even health food stores like alfalfas and the green, these health food stores were installing poisonous mercury vapor and high pressure sodium lighting, which is absolutely the most poisonous possible lighting spectra, because some marketing agent told them this is the cheapest way of getting light. But what they didn't realize is there is one form of light that is life and another form that's death, and the difference is the phase conjugate frequency spectrum.
Well, if they actually changed to better lighting, they'd have people stay longer and they'd probably buy more.
They would actually make life. People would come in because they would feel life instead of death. So mercury vapor lighting is just what it sounds like. It's pure poison because of the power spectrum.
When you use if you use a series of mirrors to bring sunlight, actually real sunlight into a place, does the bouncing off mirrors reduce the effectiveness of the sunlight?
And if the substance of those mirrors was phase conjugate, and by the way, John Dee spent this first half of his life studying how to make mirrors work to conjugate a plasma, and he ended up talking to angels. So, you got something fun to study there. And in fact, if you study how non-reflective mirrors work, and you learn how Nazis designed a paint which bounced radar, the half lambda, which is a threat to national security. Oh yeah, but it's also how the mind works. You learn how to bounce a plasma recursively and literally create life in a cauldron.
Thank you. Yeah, I got it.
Well, we have about 9 minutes. What would you like to cover? We've gone through a lot of stuff, but I'm sure there's a million things to cover, but what would you like to focus on?
Maybe we should talk a little bit about monoatomics, because that enters into the ancient issue. Sitchin said they came here to mine the gold because they were eating it. Sitchin said they came here to mine the gold because they were using it to fix their atmosphere. And
right. Also for the longevity, they ingest it.
That's right. And so we now know why a trace gold could repair atmosphere. We use the example of the glass meteorite, which was the Kaaba stone, Lucifer's eye, which became the projective powder John Dee used for philosopher's stone gold making. That particular glass meteor had a vaporized platinum group metals, either gold or palladium or platinum, and you vaporize gold through that glass like they did to make the deep purple in the Gothic cathedral Templar glass. And the vaporized gold in the glass foams to make the foam geometry a profound conjugator, and therefore a dielectric conjugate. And that's why the ancient atmosphere could also be made into a conjugator by vaporizing gold into it. But what also is true is that the gold became stable in a monoatomic form in the presence of a conjugate spark, the two gold wing tips above the Ark of the Covenant. And Lawrence Gardner got that right. That was a factory for gold powder making, the real cottage industry, cash cow of Akhenaten, and then Moses and the Essenes, which they sold internationally. And the reason mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for hundreds of years was because of the gold powder content. So, because the natron in the bandage of the mummy was a conjugate capacitor and therefore transmute the flesh into an Ormuz amulet. So the power of the monoatomic is that the geometry of the atom becomes a conjugator. Classic example, Buckminster fullerene. This is all illustrated beautifully at fractalfield.com/cold plasma, and in which we discuss the Keshe use of rotating monoatomics. So the monoatomic gold is literally popcorn for a gold atom. It was called unobtainium in Avatar, and it floats. And the gold atom turns inside out and creates non-destructive collapse, and the orbital electron field becoming then conjugate for monoatomic gold is so large it was called the plains of Sharon, which is the Hebrew name for heaven, He Ave, which means charge distribution efficiency, literally heaven, He Ave, where the breath of charge takes flight. Ave. And so why is the word for heaven also the name for the electric field around gold powder? Because it's the same physics. It's charge distribution gone infinite. And when you make gold powder soluble in blood, it implodes the DNA and your eyes turn blue and you live forever, but there's a little detail in there. It can cause fractionation of personality, which is what Thoth wrote about. He designed some exercises. But there are organic forms. When David Hudson made the monoatomics, unfortunately, it was actually a poison because it was uncontrollable in the blood. It's like making implosion sound synthetically. It's actually painful. And so purely chemically derived gold powder is actually burns holes in your aura. It's actually dangerous. Whereas really organically derived forms of the rhodium, iridium, the gold powder amulets, like Barry Carter's subtleenergies.com organic agricultural ormes. They use a caustic alkaline, and it precipitates this white from deep seawater, which is high in rhodium, iridium, and amulets. And you get agricultural ormes, which is fabulous and synergetic to the imploder.com and effective microorganisms. So the use of monoatomics, which Dr. Keshe is now pioneering from a nuclear viewpoint, is why today the Dracos do not need to mine our planet for gold. He's right. They make it. But what they still need is our DNA, because we have something in our blood which they can't make. And this is, just an introduction to the rich history of the use of monoatomic substances on the planet. And it's all at that article, fractalfield.com/cold plasma.
So is that what's behind all the abductions, the alien abductions?
Well, the abduction, the story I think is correct. I discussed this with Laura Eisenhower, that, Truman and Eisenhower, they felt intimidated by the Greys. And after the Pleiadians at that time insisted that the U.S. government give up their nukes, and Eisenhower wasn't brave enough to do that, so he got stuck with the wrong ETs and allowed the Greys to do limited abductions in return for some technological trinkets, which was pretty chicken on his part, I think. But, Laura Eisenhower apologizes for her grandfather. But at any rate, we know that the abductions, the vast majority of the abductions were effectively lucid dreamers, many with some indigenous blood, which indicates the quality of the DNA they desperately needed.
So this is ongoing. And so what do they do with these humans that are good lucid dreamers? The story was at Montauk, the predictor of ability to steer the time chair was called Boson 7, which is a political hot potato, but it was a way to measure DNA for spectral emissions, which indicate implosion, literally ensoulment, because when the braiding is recursive and implosive, the plasma around DNA is implosive. And that's what we call having a soul. And that's what the Dracos didn't have. And that's how you could steer a tornado in time, the so-called Montauk. It was called microchloridians in the blood. But we know the spectrum analysis of the DNA in the microwave would indicate this ability to implode, literally bend space and time. And this is the power potential that we, as a species, can become a vaccine in the Orion Wars, because if we actually follow our bliss and do the hygiene to have this bliss experience, the charge density, the yoga, the kundalini, the diet, the live food, living in a life force environment, then we can become that vaccine because our DNA takes on that potential.
Perhaps there's a way of synergizing with the Dracos instead of being opposed to them, and creating some kind of win-win where we and they can both get what we need.
Well, I think Wilcox is right. The blue avians have sort of created a barrier around the solar system that prevents the comings and goings of the parasites. And now we have a real chance, as the Thoth Hermes blue avian story. And yes, it is more like Pogo said, we've met and encountered the enemy, and it is us. If you believe an idea like God is outside you, you'll need a parasite like a priest to tell you creation is outside you. But once you know the physics, and you take the physics of creation internally, I am that I am, which is a physics of fractality, obviously, then you have the self-empowerment, which eliminates the need for religion wars and personality worship and miracle worship. And instead, the beautiful physics of creation exists inside.
And
wow.
1 minute. Or we're on time.
That was the happy ever had.
Thank you so much.
Dan, one last time, the website. What is your website?
Blessing. goldenmean.info, fractalfield.com. Thank you.
Look at the pictures there. They're wonderful.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Much love, blessings, and aloha.